Hello everyone. In this little lecture I would like to introduce you to the concept of logic, how to do it, what we're talking about when we're doing it. This is a standalone lesson that you can watch at any point really, but I think it will be most helpful in Unit 2, especially before you go into Unit 3. So what you hopefully picked up from Unit 1 and possibly 2 if you've looked at that already is that philosophy is an activity of asking questions that can't really be answered empirically, but that can be answered by addressing them by thinking rationally. So another word for thinking rationally is called using logic. And I want to first take a little history tour basically through Aristotle and his idea of logic. We'll be studying Aristotle's ethics later on in the semester at the end of the course, but today what I want to look at is particularly what's called a syllogism, which is a method of using a logical argument to prove something. Now, in the units folder, there's a link to the Stanford Encyclopedia on a syllogism. It's quite a useful one for you to take a look at. But first I wanted to say that Aristotle is one of three very important classical Greek philosophers. I mentioned Socrates already. He's often known as the father of philosophy, at least Western philosophy. There's a period called pre-Socratic, and then Socrates sort of starts this version of philosophy, which we call Western philosophy. Now, Socrates had a pupil called Plato, who found the Academy, it's called, and Plato becomes very important for medieval Christian philosophers, as we'll see in the next unit, Unit 3. And Plato has a pupil called Aristotle. Finally we get to Aristotle. And each philosopher sort of builds on the predecessor's work. Socrates did not publish anything. It was Plato who recorded the lectures that Socrates gave. Now Aristotle joins the Academy, but he branched off into less Platonic thoughts, and we'll talk about that later. And Aristotle was developed what we think of as logic, and logic as a methodology. Socrates used it too, but Aristotle is credited with developing modern logic. Now Anselm, who we'll read in Unit 3, he's very much aware of this heritage of a logical thinking process. He probably even is aware of Aristotle himself. And Anselm will be building on these ideas in order to prove that God exists. So I'm trying to make some connections here to the next unit, so you see the connections here and why this is useful to know. Anyway, Aristotle's interested in logic. He's interested in the best way to make an argument, to put out a proposal, a statement, and then to find out what the truth is. And basically, Aristotle says that the way you come to a conclusion determines if you arrive at truth or not. If you arrive at your conclusion the right way, the knowledge you find at the end will be truth. If you do it the wrong way, it won't be true knowledge. It will just be worthless because it's an incorrect answer. So you've got to do it the right way. So he came up with this thing called a syllogism, which is a particular structure of a sentence that makes an assertion that is either true or false. So if I say humans are mortal, that's either a true statement or a false statement. There can't be either one. It's got to be one of those. And so the syllogism is at the core of traditional logic, specifically deductive reasoning, which is where a certain fact can be determined by combining sort of existing statements. So you arrive at something new from combining some existing statements. So we get this quote here from Aristotle, which you can find on the Stanford Encyclopedia page. So a deduction is speech, or logos, in which certain things having been supposed, something different from those supposed results of necessity because of their being so. In other words, what he's saying is that if all these things are true, right, all of the things supposed are true, then something at the end has to be true too. And this is what Plato is simply put, this is what a syllogism means. You suppose several statements are true, and that will lead you to determining that your conclusion is true. You move from a premise, those are the things supposed, which is a theory or an idea, to a conclusion, which is your specific confirmation. And this is deductive logic or reasoning. So I've listed up here one of the most classic syllogisms, which starts with the premise, all humans are mortal, which we can call either Z or premise 1. premise 2 is that all Greeks are human, which would be our Y statement, and then that leads us to our conclusion, all Greeks are mortal. So if we were to diagram this out, it would be if Y and Z are true, then X must be true, right? And so keep in mind that Y and Z are those things supposed from the statement above, right? Certain things having been supposed, something different results. The thing that's different is our X, right? All Greeks are mortal. So those of you who are math majors probably find this very easy to follow. The rest of you might not. But I've given you another kind of diagram. You've got your premise, premise 1, premise 2. You could have a whole bunch of them, and that leads to your conclusion. Now the arrow indicates the sort of inference, the relationship that all your P's, and you could have a whole bunch of them. Those are all your reasons for believing that C, your conclusion, is true. Now, just a little hint here, inductive reasoning works kind of the opposite direction. You start with a very specific observation in order to figure out the pattern, and then you move backwards to the theory. And this would be more the scientific method, right? That Locke, Hume, the obvious sciences, biology, they're going to start from this observation, prove the hypothesis, and then replicate it, and then you can prove it as fact or as truth, right? So there's kind of a difference going there. Now in a syllogism, you'll have usually just two, a major premise and a minor premise. I'll look at some arguments a little bit later where you can have multiple premise, but in a syllogism it tends to be your kind of major one, which is all humans are mortal, and then you get your minor one, which is all Greeks are human. Right? And that leads you to realizing that Greeks have to be mortal, right? Because if Greeks are human and humans are mortal, then Greeks have to be mortal. Now the thing that you have to realize is if something's wrong in your minor or major premise, then it will skew the conclusion. Another thing to remember is that a syllogism works from stuff we already know, and it's called a priori knowledge. And a priori knowledge is kind of independent of experience. For example, a syllogism like all bachelors are unmarried, right? You know what the word bachelor means, then you know that he's obviously unmarried. A novel like Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice starts with this kind of syllogistic thinking. The first sentence of the novel is, "It's a truth universally acknowledged that a single man of good fortune must be in want of a wife." Now we could say this starts from a valid kind of a priori knowledge that single men are not married, therefore probably single men need a wife, but it doesn't actually lead by necessity to the conclusion that all single men want a wife. So even though she sets up this first sentence kind of as a syllogism, Austen's characters end up they're skewing it by assuming that just because some single men want a wife, all single men do. Right? Now it would be changed slightly if we say all single men don't have a wife. That would be true. But the skewing comes in here on the idea that all single men need a wife or want a wife. That's where our syllogism ends up skewed. So as I said, the syllogism tended to work from stuff we know, this a priori knowledge. We know theoretically that a single man or a bachelor by definition is unmarried. I don't have to go around asking every single bachelor, are you married, because I just know from the term. So the thing with a syllogism is, or this kind of thinking works if you are working with a priori knowledge, you're working with statements that you are sure are true, like humans are mortal. But if you start with a premise, if you said humans are immortal, then obviously your conclusion is going to be false. So this is really key when you get to any deductive argument. The validity and the truth of your statement is only as strong as your premise is. Now at this point I want to end our specific looking at Aristotle and look at the term a little bit more broadly, not just at syllogisms but at arguments themselves. So I want to look at parts of arguments and how you recognize them. So if I asked you a question like what major should we study in college, we can come up with a statement which is English is the most important subject, or I could change that to philosophy is the most important subject, therefore Leah should major in English. And I'm just going to stick with English because that's what I happen to major in college. Now this statement, this answer to the question, makes an argument. It provides an answer and gives a reason or evidence for that answer. So keep in mind that in philosophy, An argument is a unit of reasoning that attempts to prove that a certain idea is true by citing other ideas as evidence. Now, to go through this a little more carefully, the idea that an argument is attempting to prove is called the ultimate conclusion. And all arguments have only one ultimate conclusion. Keep this in mind. Now, ideas that the argument uses as evidence to prove the ultimate conclusion, but, and here's the key case, which you just assume to be true without giving us any reason to believe that it's true, is called a premise. Right? So keep that in mind. The ideas that you're using as evidence, but you don't first establish those ideas as being true, you just assume they are, that's called your premise. All arguments have to have at least one premise, and they can have any number of them. You can have a whole bunch of premisi. My Latin's not so good. So keep that in mind. Just like we saw with the syllogism, you've got a major premise and a minor premise. With a general philosophical argument, you can have a whole lot of premisi. I think that's correct. Now, intermediate ideas on the way from the premise to the ultimate conclusion are called subconclusions. Right? An argument will give you a reason to believe a subconclusion, but it's not the conclusion that it's ultimately trying to get us to believe. It's just a step on the way. So an argument might not have any subconclusion, but usually you do have some. And the interference is the connection that holds between the set of ideas, the premises or even subconclusions, but we'll call them a reason, and the other idea, which we call conclusion. Right? So when the truth of all your ideas in your reason is supposed to establish the truth of your seed. That would be that arrow that I showed you. If you were taking Introduction to Logic, you'd learn how to do these diagrams. But now I just want you to, if you come across, things set up, those sort of diagrams or arguments set up that way, you'll know what it is you're looking at. So here's our little summary. The ultimate conclusion is what the passage or the statement is trying to prove. Premises are taken for granted by the argument, but without any evidence or support. That's just the taken for granted bit. And subconclusions are intermediate steps that help you on the way. So in order to identify the parts of an argument, you can do two things. You need to start out by asking, what is the main idea that the argument is trying to prove? Okay? And once you find the main idea, that will be your ultimate conclusion of your argument. And then, for all the other important ideas, you ask, does the argument give us a reason to believe this true? Or does the argument just take this for granted? And again, if it does give you a reason, it's the subconclusion. If it doesn't give you a reason to believe it, and instead just assumes this is true, that's a premise. So these are the steps you need to take, especially in Unit 3. This is going to be key to one of your assignments. You're going to want to read your article, and you want to ask these parts, ask these questions, and that will help you figure out what's the premise, what's the subconclusion, what's the ultimate conclusion. So if we looked at this statement here, and we had to find out what's the premise, what's the conclusion, here's our two statements, or two parts of the statement. English is the most important subject, therefore Leah should major in English. Think about it for a second here and try to figure out which is the conclusion, which is the premise. The premise is English is the most important subject. Our conclusion is Leah should major in English. Right? The thing that is telling us we should do is that Leah should major in English. English is the most important subject is the reason why Leah should major in English. There is no evidence given of why English is the most important subject. It's just a statement that we need to take for granted if we're going to accept this statement. You could substitute anything else. History is the most important subject. Philosophy is the most important subject. Biology is the most important subject, right? Each one of those are making a claim without actually proving why. If we started saying little things, philosophy is the most important subject because it teaches you how to think logically and everybody needs to know how to think logically, you would start giving more and more reasons. But anyway, in this case, Leah should major in English is our conclusion, and the premise that's given to support that idea is that English is the most important subject. Now there's a little hint. There are what's called a conclusion indicator expression, and I've listed a bunch of them here. The one that we just used is the first one, which is statement X, therefore Y. In this case, English is the most important subject, therefore Leah should major in English. That's using exactly that one, right? We establish X, that's our premise, therefore y must follow. And here's a whole bunch of them. Thus, consequently, hence, so, this goes to show, it follows, as a result, this is why, which implies, which means that. All of those statements are statements in which y is our conclusion and x is the reason given to believe y. Now, not every single argument or statement will have these indicator expressions. It's not like you can just look through and, here's my result, because not everyone has that. But these are, if you see these kinds of statements like these, you can see those, it should trigger you to go, oh, these are those kind of conclusion indicator. You'll know that whatever follows those terms will be your conclusion, whatever comes on the front side of it will be your premise. That is all I will have to show for this logic, introduction to logic little mini lesson. Definitely watch it for Unit 3. There's going to be a lot of stuff. I'm just going to assume that you watch this video and you know what I'm talking about. I'll be using the terms, but I wanted to give you this in a little package so that you could watch it over again without having to wade through other topics that I'm covering. So have fun.